It is for you. Thank you for joining us. Hey, Melissa.
Hey Reza, how you doing?
Good, good. Thank you. Very good to have you in this talk, and very nice to have you all attending in this talk as well. I'm sure this is going to be quite engaging and informative discussions. Um, I think I've met Melissa in one of past events. It might be like a SQL Saturday a while ago, or it might be one of like past summits. Every time I talk about past, it's like a little bit of sadness that it is not there anymore. But I mean, it is there, just like a little bit different, I would say. Uh, how are you doing?
Well, considering the state of the world, I'm doing well. Busy work-wise and healthy personal-wise, so it's all I can ask for at the moment.
That
How are
is,
you doing?
that is good. Yeah, I mean, New Zealand is pretty good these days. It's a good place to be. So yeah, doing all right. Dealing with a lot of clients on Power BI side of things, which I'm sure you are also dealing on the Power BI, especially on the governance. And you also recently developed a course, and I think you actually delivered it sometimes already, the Power BI governance, right?
Yeah, we had the first series of sessions in January and February, and the next series starts April 13th. So in just a couple weeks here, and it's basically a 5-week series of sessions where we just go into deep dive with the gamut of things that you want to think about with regard to overseeing Power BI effectively.
Great, thank you, and that's a great course. I would definitely recommend everyone to to have a look at. Sorry, to have a look at the course details in Melissa's website down under her video feed. So talking about governance, let's start this with what. How do you define governance? What is it? And I'm sure you have some slides to go through it, but I'm just uh, popping that
Yeah, I
out.
do.
Yeah.
Yeah, before we get into that formal part of it, though, sure. I define governance as essentially the policies and the processes that your organization has to manage data effectively.
Uh, yeah, I like the definition of like policies and processes because a lot of people, when we talk about governance, they think it's like a set of features. Features by itself doesn't really do anything. The process that you define around it and the way that you use it is actually making it important. Like the feature can be there, but you never use it, or you use it in a wrong way. That's great. I see we have Donald, Cecilia, Gina, Gaston, used a lot of friends on the call. Thank you all for joining.
Well, hi, everybody.
So let's get started. If you can start with first introducing yourself, and we try to
Sure
keep it
thing.
also kind of conversational. So anyone who have any questions, just feel free to write it in the chat window. I'll make sure that I'll pass it to the to Melissa in this discussion, as long as it is related to that.
Sounds good. Thanks. And I just shared my screen. So yeah, if you will flip that over. And so yeah, let's just dive in. And this session's called Top Essential Actions for Governing Power BI. We've got 10 of them to go through. We'll see how time goes. But as Reza said, my name's Melissa Coates. I run a company called Coates Data Strategies, which is, me, myself, and I, small but mighty. And because there's so darn much to keep up with in the data platform world these days, in the last couple of years, I've found myself specializing more and more on the governance and administration side of things. So I'm really excited to talk to you about this today because it's kind of right in my wheelhouse. So what we have focused on here today, I'm going to give you just a super speedy data governance overview, just to level set a couple of things. And share just a couple thoughts of how I view the world, basically. And then we've got these kind of top 10 actions, if you will, really a high level thing for you to consider. And then I've got for each one of those just, 2 or 3 things that you could do right now in order to get started in that area. And if all goes well, Q&A wise, we'll have a few minutes at the end. And I know Race is going to keep an eye on the Q&A panel as well as we go through. So spoiler alert, here are the 10 things that we're going to go ahead and review as we step through things. If you would like a copy of the presentation materials that you're seeing right here, if you go to coatesds.com, which is just short for Coates Data Strategies, go to the presentations page, and there's a PDF down there that you can download. Now, I'm assuming that if you're listening to this, you basically already are using Power BI, right? You're familiar with a lot of the basics, and you're just kind of aware that, yeah, we're doing some things. Some things might be going really, really well, but there's almost always areas of improvement. So having said that, we're not really going to focus on a lot of the, fundamentals, what is Power BI or specific features or anything like that. We're talking more high level. Let's start with that high-level overview. And this image is actually from some migration documents that we published a few months ago on the doc site. But I use it because the idea that this expresses applies whether you're quote unquote migrating or not. And really what I want to convey is that you might be initially setting things up and evaluating what Power BI can do for you, and there's some governance things that are going to come up then. Also, as you're just starting to create solutions, right? People are working in Power BI Desktop, they start to deploy things, governance and deployment and administration and security, all those things are going to pop up. Same thing if you're doing, some formal migration. And then really the point here is that most diagrams you see, whether it's Azure or Power BI or anything, kind of have the whole adoption and governance and monitoring, at the end, so to speak. But really, it should always happen all along. It's always iterative and it never ends. So really the most successful companies have this balance of new work happening while progressively improving on the techniques, your governance techniques that you use for successful execution. To that end, there's really always 2 paths that you want to be working on: building out your governance groundwork and also handling your most pressing needs, right? And it's always this balance of both. When I say data governance, what do I mean? And it will mean something just a little bit different to each one of you that are listening to this. The one thing in particular that I want to call out is that from a governance perspective and an administration perspective, I don't actually use those terms interchangeably, and I keep noticing sometimes people do. And so as we said briefly at the beginning, the governance side is more of the formal side of things, right? Putting some formality around the processes that you are doing. Administration is more about the day-to-day activities that are going to make those governance policies, come to life, if you will. Here's an official.
Sorry, just an interruption here, if you don't mind.
Please.
One of the things, you are going to bring that defining the data governance, but one of the things I hear a lot from a lot of organizations, especially the main stakeholders, the sponsor of BI project and things like that, is that they want to know what is the benefit of governance for them. Let's say there's someone in the board of directors, he or she is sponsoring the whole overall Power BI project. She wants the reports to be developed as fast as possible, a lot of insight, but they might not have an idea of what would be the benefit of having proper data governance. I'm sure that is in your agenda, but just popping that into.
Sure. So to a certain extent, it's reining in the chaos. But it's also making it clear to people, and by people I mean your content authors and your consumers, what can they do? How far can they take things on their own, assuming that you are trying to enact a lot of self-service, right?
Mhm.
But within the requisite guardrails that you need to have, right? And those guardrails will depend on what regulatory framework you have to operate under, what industry you're under, what country you operate in, et cetera. So there's a variety of benefits, and you're right. We're going to kind of march towards answering that, and part of it is answered here, right? So I tend to say, what does it mean when we want to govern data? And I use these 4 pillars, if you will, a little bit. And then the other thing we want to think about is sometimes the word governance is a dirty word a little bit,
Mm.
right? I'm sure you've probably had some customers that say, yeah, we don't want to use that word. It evokes too much command and control
Mm.
mentality. So sometimes you might hear the words data utility in terms of trying to use a replacement word. Just recently, I heard of a data advocacy program, which was kind of an interesting one. But to kind of almost come back to the question you just asked about benefits, we can save users so many headaches when we have a good plan for our governance, right? So I think about governance from the aspect of user enablement. One of my key beliefs is if we have a good governance plan with a focus on user enablement and those guardrails, we can dramatically improve the user experience that people have with Power BI, because it gets complex and it's wide and it's broad and it's deep. And so does that kind of make sense with the experience you've had as well?
Yes, yeah, definitely. Like what I have seen a lot with many of my clients is that like the stage that they normally come to us at least and ask about putting a governance in place is something like this. Like they've already started having Power BI reports. A lot of people in the company went and learned Power BI in all different ways, from YouTube, from books. They started building their own reports. They ended up with like tons of silos of Power BI. Everyone has their own version of this particular calculation. The manager don't really know, is this the right calculation or that the right calculation. There isn't like no trust in this, and they think it is because of the tool or something like that, but it is actually the
Yeah.
process and that overall governance around it that needs to be defined.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the word trust. So that's actually our, tip number 2 that we're going to get to. We do have one to cover briefly first, but yes, trust is huge. So yeah, let's kind of march towards that a little bit here. And where I want to start though is this kind of really understand what's happening in your company. So pretty much anytime I ever talk about anything Power BI related, I have to show a version of this, right? And I think that we all can relate to, if we're in any sort of sizable organization, that all 3 of these are happening in most organizations. So on the far right, we've got a situation where we're saying this is true self-service BI. Business authors or the owners of the data and the reports have responsibility end to end. The far left, it's more of a central team, whether it's IT, whether it's the BI team, whether it's a center of excellence, whoever it is, it's all centralized. And then you've got some sort of blended approach in the middle. But here's the kicker, is that it's not like a company can say, oh yeah, we're the one in the middle, because almost everybody has all 3 of them happening at once and can even have all 3 of them happening inside the same department or business unit. So the big reason that I bring it up here is understanding what's actually happening currently will inform a lot of the decisions that you're going to make when you're figuring out the rules of the road from a governance perspective. So if you're not sure, have some conversations, right, with people in your different business units, because you just can't effectively govern Power BI if you don't really understand what people are really doing. Is there one of these that you see most often in your projects, Reza?
Yes, I see quite a lot of enterprise BI and like business-led self-service BI. The combination of those is something that I always have to work with organization to get them working on that combination. And that is also another thing which I'm sure when we get to Center of Excellence, we'll have some discussions about it, that the enterprise BI team, if there is such a team in the organization, always want to control that, well, all the reports has to be even built by our team. If you want to build it, you have to come and sit within our little office here and build it. On the other hand side, the self-service team says, no, we want to have full flexibility. So there are always like this challenge. I'll see
For
that.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like a natural tension between them all, which can be this healthy thing, but can also be very difficult depending on all the politics and how users in the departments are used to working with IT, right? Lots of long-standing baggage can be there that make it less than healthy. But the tips here that I would leave you with in this area is, really thinking about what is your current state and just make a plan. It doesn't have to be perfect next month, right? Continual iterative improvement. And start thinking about, right, with those 3 columns, which groups in your organization can and really should manage their own content. And if decentralized data ownership gives you some chills, is that a valid concern because of your industry or the requirements you have? Or is that something that, I come from a data warehousing background, right? So I always want to centralize the data. But in reality, that's not always really going to happen. So, what makes sense and how effectively can we make all of them happen? And in that regard, when we do have co-ownership scenarios, right, figure out how those are going to be handled, because that gets to be the trickiest thing. And by co-ownership, I mean things like one team manages the data and another team manages reports, or sometimes even multiple teams have to collaborate on a consolidated data set, which gets even trickier.
Yeah, the ownership is definitely a really important aspect. Something that not many organizations think about it. They just create something and they want to not take the ownership, because then they would have the responsibility of saying that this is the right one.
Yep, fair point. Fair point. So that takes us to trustworthiness. And, we looked at these top 4 pillars very briefly at the beginning. Trustworthiness is one of the big ones and one of my favorite ones. But what do I really mean by trustworthy content? Well, certainly quality, right? We're going to verify it and check our data quality, right? Everybody kind of knows that one, whether or not you do the right thing or not. But how about we're going to use common definitions, and our key performance indicators are all consistent, right? And defined and so forth. And that ownership that we just talked about, and we might have an owner that's separate from the subject matter expert, right? If there's a separate technical owner, that kind of thing, that's separate from a data steward, and the data steward in a source system might be different from downstream analytics, right? So all of that can be, not necessarily as simple as it initially seems. Things like your data provenance and your lineage. So basically, how's the data changing and moving over time? We gotta know that. And we minimize data duplication. So one of my favorite topics, and one we're going to expand on here in just a moment. Our data and our load processes are managed and secured, and that includes when we use Power BI from an end-to-end perspective, from doing the data preparation and loading it into a model, right? Lots of considerations there to put the Power BI file in a secure place, etc. We've got awareness of the content. Fundamentally, it's more trustworthy if it's been cataloged, for instance, and documented. And then finally, clear expectations about how are we going to use this data responsibly. So if this whole idea is something that you want to know more about, I just did a whole hour-long presentation last week on the topic of trustworthiness. So there's a link at the bottom there for you. Let's talk a little bit more about not duplicating the data. So I've already admitted I have the data warehousing background. So this is something, though, that really is important. And it's important from the perspective of more than just IT is going to manage the data and business users are going to create the reports, right? Even people in the business units can absolutely take advantage of this kind of pattern. And all we're talking about here is creating not necessarily one behemoth shared data set, but fewer data sets, certainly not one data set for every report file. And we reuse them across Live Connection. We can reuse them with Excel, et cetera. And some people call this, the golden data set within reports. Some people call it hub and spoke method. The feature in Power BI would be shared data set plus Live Connection, or direct query to Power BI data sets, which we're going to talk about here in a second. So I assume that you see this used pretty heavily in most of your projects, at least once you get people past that initial phase where they're just learning how to work in Power BI desktop. I'm going to take that as a yes.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the sorry, my microphone seems to be mute at that time. One of the points that I see a lot is that, so of course, like this is helpful now recently with the announcement of direct query to Power BI datasets, which I'm sure you'll get to that.
Yep.
Like there are a lot of power in that feature, which self-service users love it. On the other hand side, like the enterprise BI are a little bit conservative on that. Are we, like, if we enable that, are we going to have a lot of more silos again on that or not? But definitely this is something that I see happening a lot, that the ability to have fewer data sets is nowadays considered much more than what it used to be like in a couple of years ago.
True. And, for years and years and years, we would have called this something like managed self-service BI. Microsoft's calling it discipline at the core and flexibility at the edge. And the Microsoft documentation does talk about how IT owns the data set. But again, that's not mandatory to get the advantages from this. Now, if we take that one step further, here in the middle, I'm showing 3 shared data sets that power up a bunch of different reports. But then we're going to take it one step further, and we're going to start saying, well, since I have 3 data sets, and there's, a good justification, right, for why those aren't all just one. But I don't want to repeat the same logic inside of Power Query, inside of every single one of those data sets. So I'm going to decouple the data preparation. So we've already decoupled the model from the reports. And now we're going to decouple the data preparation from the model. And so that action actually happens in Power Query Online. So all of this ends up being a habit change for your Power BI authors that start to understand the advantages of not just having everything in a single Power BI PBIX file. And then if we want to take that one step further, right? So basically what we've been discussing has been something like right here. And the new part is up here. And what happens essentially is that direct query connection ends up switching to let me rephrase. That live connection query connection changes to be a direct query. It's so easy for me to spit this out, right? And so theoretically, the same thing's happening, but the downstream data sets, so you can often think of these as a departmental data set maybe, and then the top level one is our core centralized or organizational data set, right? And so it might get data from various places, including data flows, right? The downstream data sets might go get more data from additional sources. It can even go to, more data flows, et cetera. So it starts to build upon that notion of enabling self-service BI model authors being able to take advantage of maybe 80% of what they need is already in the organizational model, but they have to customize it and add a little bit more to it. And that's where the power really comes in. So this is a really new feature. It's young, it's still growing up, but it has a lot of promise from the self-service BI perspective.
That is definitely a very important point. Of course, what I have seen is that, like, as soon as this is rolled out, a lot of our clients actually loved this feature, especially because previously the way that they did it was they either created a copy of that data set with some new changes, which is like totally wrong, because then you have duplication of your code, your DAX measures, and anything like that. Or they did like importing from like whatever is there in the original data source, like if they had XMLA endpoint or something like that, they imported, like importing from analysis services, which causes normally a lot of other challenges because that import sometimes acts like a cross join. So definitely useful in terms of the feature. In terms of the usage of that, I've seen this works quite a lot good with certifying things, like for example not saying that now these two data sets that are like changed version are, let's say, as certified as the original one if it is not tested. And I'm sure you have your certifying section coming up as well.
Indeed. And so in this scenario, in all likelihood, the top level one probably in all likelihood should be certified. And so in the Power BI world, we refer to these as endorsements. And certified really means that we want to say this content's trustworthy. Some rigor has occurred, right? We have done validations. Whereas promoted content is more like just saying, hey, this is available. And it doesn't mean that it's not trustworthy, but it does mean that it's something less than certified. And so at the moment, we can certify or set endorsements, I should say, to collectively use promoted as well, to data sets, data flows, both types of reports, and also collectively as apps. And so I'm actually going to publish a new video on this here as well, but in this, as part of this larger presentation, I've got a segment of it where I talk about the distinction between these different types of objects is actually really important. So if you are saying, I'm going to use a certified data set, that means I'm an author, that I am willing to accept that as a dependency in the solution that I'm building, right? Whereas if you're going to use a certified report, it's more like, oh, I'm a consumer of this content, and yes, I will trust it for making my business decisions. And then collectively certifying things in an app is a lot more to talk about there than we have time to talk about. So I dive into it a little more, and I'm also going to publish another little something on it soon. But there's quite a bit here to it. In terms of suggestions, think about really using shared data sets when you know that same set of data, the same calculations, et cetera, is going to be used across reports, and you don't necessarily want to have 30 reports in the same Power BI file, right? You want to start thinking about decoupling when you create your data sets, when you create your reports. That helps us with who owns what. From a governance perspective, helps us advance reuse of data, which helps us advance trustworthiness, which should align very nicely with governance goals. And then once you have started figuring out how that all will work, start thinking about your certified and promoted endorsements. And we'll talk more about what a certified process might look like, at least a very light one here in just a second. Any other comments or questions we want to tackle before moving on?
I see a lot of like people interesting, loving that, and agreeing with a lot of points mentioning here, like Donald, especially Gina. So no, not a specific question by itself, but I
Love
think
it.
this area is quite important. Something that a lot of people don't consider. Like they know that they have to certify dataset, but they don't normally define a process that says what is important for that.
Yes. Yes, yes, yes. And we'll touch on that here in a second. What I want to do is first introduce the idea of guiding principles, and then I want to talk about processes and policies very briefly, and we're going to use certified as an example there. So that's where we're headed in the next few minutes. But first, I want to introduce this idea of a guiding principle, right? And we think about this from the high level. You already implicitly know there's always conflicting priorities and conflicting opinions on, how much user enablement and flexibility are we going to give people versus we need to lock things down because we need to manage risk. And that's always going to be a constant issue of balance, right? So something for you to think about is this idea between offense and defense. So if you have more of an offensive strategy or mindset, you're focused on things like growing revenue and meeting your business goals. Whereas if you have more of a defensive mindset, you're really focused on more of risk reduction and, privacy and compliance. And those things are really important too. So, if you're saying, well, geez, I have to think about both. Well, yep. But here's the thing is, depending on which way you're going to tip and end up favoring more so, right? If you're in healthcare, for instance, you're always going to tip a little more on the defensive side. If you're, say, a retail business, you might have the luxury of tipping more on, the offense side. So it means how much tolerance do you have for needing to have that single version of truth, or how much chaos can you actually handle in order to allow things to move fast and things to get done very quickly, right? And you can see the direct correlation here in terms of allowing people to get things done in Power BI. So, guiding principle, right? So maybe your CTO likes to say all the time, everyone's a data steward, right? And that's his or her way of saying that secure delivery of data rests with us all. And so that if that's something that's already out there, we call that a pervasive cultural norm. And that can be a guiding principle. And that's going to help us with decision making. Another example, we might say we have certain critical data elements, maybe our customer data, that we're going to manage more so than other types of data. So from a suggestion perspective, think about where you're at, which side you tend to lean towards more so. And if you're just getting started with governance, right, you might not have the luxury of having a governance board that hands you down a beautiful set of starting principles or policies or whatever. So if you're just getting started, just come up with a top few things that really just absolutely make sense. They should almost be like an obvious, of course, kind of a statement. But what that means that is if you get these squared away, you have your first step towards where you're headed with the next piece, which is your data policies. So here's where, we have to start putting in a little bit of structure or boundaries. So let's say you've got some organizational objectives, right? And you've got some guiding principles like we just talked about. So a policy would be lining up to those. Well, what do we need to do and why? And then we'd have processes, procedures, standards that align with a policy. Now, within that dotted line, I kind of don't care if those are separate documents or one document, whatever fits your style of working. But these are the pieces of the puzzle. And let me give you an very simplified but an actual example of the pieces so you get what I mean. So maybe the organization says, we're going to be data driven. We're going to improve our decision making, right? One of those beautiful, very measurable goals, right? So our guiding principle is about our critical data elements, right? We're going to manage and audit them properly to improve our decision making. So perhaps we have a policy that says any of our Power BI data sets that contain our critical data elements, they need to have data definitions defined, they have to have sensitivity labels assigned, and they have to be certified, right? That would be a policy that might be in place to align with that guiding principle. So then you might have a couple of processes, for instance, like what is your data certification process? Or how exactly do you go about setting up your data definitions, right? And that just might be over in a data catalog. It might be in Excel. It could be a number of things. And then a standard is something we can measure. And it might be something like 100% of our certified data sets have to have an owner assigned. And, you know, in Power BI, right, that would be a contact. Or we might say 85% of our certified data sets, we're gonna go ahead and give them a re-review twice a year, right? Because if we went ahead and certified them at a point in time, but then changes happen, right? We don't want to necessarily slow down those changes, so we might have a re-review kind of schedule. So you mentioned this earlier, Reza, that a lot of companies don't really have a data certification process, and you know, this is something that in my full materials, right, I go way more in depth than this, but for this conversation, right, the kind of at a minimum things you want to think about are knowing about, you know, your sources, your lineage, do a tech review on your model, do a security review. And I don't mean just row level security inside the Power BI file. I mean, where's it being deployed to, right? How about data accuracy? How about, is there some documentation that's required, et cetera? And then from the report side, you know, reviewing the content, and then how much of a data review needs to go along with that kind of, you know, depends on what data it started with, for sure.
Very, very good guidelines here. And I liked actually the way that you came from like the data policy and guideline down into this certification path. Something which is really important, and I have seen only like a little organizations thinking about it. They say, well, we want to certify it, but then they don't really have like a process defined. So it is really important to define a process and say what is actually certified data set.
Yeah. And this is just a taste to like get you thinking, right? But how do you make sure if it's certified that it's trustworthy? That is the question. So think about, you know, what existing decisions you can use if you already have them, whether it's from a formal, you know, governance group, from your change management group, or whatever. Don't reinvent the wheel when you don't have to. But, you know, Power BI being an animal of its own with self-service, you know, you might need to make some tweaks. And then think about these data policies that you start to craft. Make them short, make them clear, make them easy to use, make them easily findable, so that there's not a lot, you know, you're not adding a big bump in the road here. And then just pick your most important thing to start with. So I used data certification as an example. Data ownership policy is another really common place to start. A data handling policy is another really common place to start. And we're not going to end up having time to talk about it in this session, but in a nutshell, what I mean by that is, let's say you come up with your set of sensitivity labels that you would categorize your content with, right? You have a data handling policy that goes along with those that says what you can and cannot do when content is assigned to that. And some of that is educating your users, and some of it are things that you can set up from an automated perspective, like data loss prevention policies, et cetera. Okay, so roles and responsibilities. I'm just going to take a moment here to say that, back to my favorite 3 columns, depending on how you do this has a great, big, huge impact on your roles and responsibilities. And, just really think about what is expected of the people that are involved, and what are they not allowed to do, and try to figure out, because you will have ambitious people that actually want to stretch the boundaries of what you would normally think they would do. How do you build in some flexibility to account for that when you have that industrious person that wants to take a solution farther than you might have expected? So the way I see the world is this. The people, your self-service people that own and produce content, and your subject matter experts, they are your foundation. So let's start here. Level 1, those foundational people, those are our content authors. They are publishing content. They are setting up security for the content. You might have an admin or 2 that's keeping an eye on things. But if you have any volume of activity going on in your Power BI tenant, you can't keep an eye on everything. Then you've got level 2, and you might call this something different, right? But your people that do data governance and the people that do center of excellence type of work, and we're going to touch on that briefly here in just a few minutes, right? They are there to support the level 1 people, and it's absolutely collaborative, right? They're not just writing the rules and handing them down. It should all be the level 1 people are helping to craft the rules. And I know that's all way easier said than done. I do get that. Then you've got your audit and compliance level. You might decide that internal audit and external audit are actually 2 different levels because it's such a meaningful difference, and that's okay too. For simplicity, I just lumped them together here. And then, of course, you've got some executives sitting on top. So to wrap up this section, you do have to know who your sponsor is, or your ultimate Power BI owner, and make sure this person has authority to help you get stuff done throughout the organization. Because sometimes you might come up with a policy that, even though I just said a couple minutes ago, yeah, you got to kind of try to be flexible. Sometimes you also need it to have teeth, and it just applies throughout the organization, and you need somebody who has that much authority to help you get it done. Define your roles and responsibilities. They can improve over time for sure, but when it makes sense, make sure that they're actually on the HR job description and not just this casual thing that you added. And then finally, do help people understand what their role is for safeguarding data, because really it's those frontline people that need to be taught what they need to do to make this all happen really well. Any thoughts on that? And while you're thinking about that, Reza, I'm actually going to jump up to number 9 just to kind of keep us on schedule time-wise.
Sure. Yeah. In terms of role and responsibility, definitely something that I see still a lot of organization lacking on that. Like, they want everyone to do everything. That is, kind of like looks good when you look at it from like outside, but when you look it inside, then no one actually has, let's say, the ownership. No one has the responsibility, because if everyone is doing like that report, then who actually owns it? Who ensures that this is the right result? If there is a, let's say, centralized data set and reports are built on top of that, who actually is responsible for taking control of that? Or like all of these things, like defining those roles and responsibility is definitely like a big thing for all organizations, in my point of view, which actually leads to this point that you are talking about as well. I get a lot of people, like we do a lot of training in Radicat. I get a lot of companies coming to us like at first they ask, well, what is your most extensive Power BI training? Like we want to do it for all of our report developers. They don't have that idea that, like, let's say, well, this person doesn't do, let's say, let's say the administration, this person doesn't do the architecture, this person doesn't do the report development. They have like different roles and responsibility, and based on that they should have different training. So definitely something I see is a big lack in many organizations.
Yeah, yeah. And there's so many things that it's just easier said than done, for sure. And then there's also the matter of you might have somebody that's really interested in owning it and getting it done now, but maybe that person changes job roles and then it fizzles out. And yeah, there's just so much stuff. It's hard. I mean, all this stuff that we're talking about is just not easy.
Correct. Yes. I get also a comment from Steven that is saying, very interesting content, Melissa. For a client, I'm currently working on data-driven strategy, and this is all very applicable, even though all the platform choice decision hasn't been made yet. So
Good. Yeah. I did actually try to not take this one too far in the weeds on the technical side, but yeah, you're right.
Yeah, I think most of the things you mentioned here can be like kind of platform agnostic anyway. Based on most of the platform, you should be able to go through those processes anyway.
Sure. And this next one especially so. So it's really about supporting your internal community of people. So your authors, your consumers, heck, even your admins, right? The people that are your champions, that are, your champions, those people that love Power BI and voluntarily just choose to learn it deeply and voluntarily help to, help their coworkers. They almost act like first line support for you. But there's so much involved with regard to supporting a community. So here on the screen are some of the biggies, right? The way I see it, though, because there's always this balance of helping with the user empowerment side, but reducing risk that bad things will happen, right? That data leakage won't happen, poor security won't happen, etc. So one of the best ways, I think, to decrease that risk is to help people with knowledge. So I'm just curious, Reza, if any of these particular buckets, if you see customers being better or worse at, any of the individual buckets.
I would say most of them are like good at building like a resource center. Like there are 2-3 people in the organization who have started, let's say, using Power BI. They gradually became like more like Power BI champions in the organization. They provide like a list of resources. This is the document to go and learn. This is the YouTube channel to go and learn from it. This is the Power BI community website and things like that. They build something like that, and they are like the channel for supporting others, but they don't go through all of these process. For example, like as I mentioned, like the different training for different roles and things like that. These are, I would say, the area that needs still development in many organizations.
Yeah, agreed. Okay.
I also got a question, it's more related to the roles you talked about before, from Ilya, talking that the problem I can see is that how to make organization to keep focus on those roles that we define, especially over a period of time when the individual changes roles, which I think goes back to bringing that into more formal HR definition.
Yeah, true. And the big companies where people change job roles every 6 or 12 months makes that really tricky. And it makes content ownership handoffs tricky, supporting this thing that somebody built really tricky. So yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in some regards, sometimes you might use the roles and responsibilities primarily when something goes wrong, right? But hopefully it can also just be there from a reference of, well, here are all the things that, you should be very good at from a job role perspective, and, kind of help people with almost like a personal growth plan, or at least a piece of it, that kind of thing. So I'm kind of hinting at the positive and the negative aspect there. But yeah, I think it comes down to your culture a lot on that sort of thing, right? How formal do you get with some things versus just kind of how things are always done, which would be a more informal way of things. And then it might come just down to how your manager does things.
Mm.
So in terms of helping to support your community, I mean, we could talk for a whole nother hour or two on just that, right? But think about having some sort of internal Power BI hub where you have kind of home base for all of the things that your internal folks might need, right? Technology-wise, doesn't matter, just whatever's convenient and you're able to support easily, right? If it's Word documents sitting on SharePoint, okay, at least you're making progress. And think about once you've got that hub set up and you've got some documentation, and maybe you've got an internal chat location or help location, right? In the tenant settings, there's those there's 3 items on the help menu that you can actually customize to go to your own specific organization area instead of, generic Power BI areas out on the web. So that's a really nice thing to continue getting people used to using that home base and stop doing things like, emailing one person with a question, right? And go to the main area. But last but certainly not least, right, is thinking about how are we going to cultivate our data culture, right? And data culture, I got to mention Matthew Roche, right? He has a great series of articles and videos on the concept of data culture. And so the way he defines it is that it promotes and encourages data-driven decisions, basically by more people throughout the organization. And so, it's not just reserved for the higher level managers and so forth. And what we're driving at here when we say, well, let's try to cultivate this. What do we really mean by that? We mean that we want to rely on data for our decision making, and we want to do this with more stakeholders. And, granted, the person preparing the report might not be the decision maker, but they could be very influential in that. The more effective and the better they are at their job at storytelling and conveying the information on the data. But what we want to reduce is relying on tribal knowledge. And that, I mean, we always got to ask Joe, right? Because Joe always knows. And really advance some of the things that we have in our environment, like documentation, like cataloging, like our level of data literacy. There's a bazillion of them, right? That makes the entire population of people a more adept data culture. And then because we are relying on data more, that idea of just whoever is our highest paid person in the room gets to just make the decision off of his gut. We're fundamentally trying to reduce that sort of thing when we're talking about advancing a data culture. And so here, we are really saying that data is an important asset. We're going to treat it as such. And that is a big investment, not just on the technology side, but it's a huge investment on the people side. So you might ask, we haven't talked about a center of excellence yet. So where does that fit into this? And I don't care if you call it a center of excellence. What I propose is that you have a group of people who do this set of things. They are a set of experts inside your organization, and they are charged with providing support to others in the organization. So regardless if you formally have it, if your central BI team does these items, or whomever. We need to nurture that internal community and advance our data culture continually, ongoing, never ends, right? We need to build that network of our Power BI champions and experts throughout the organization. Some of those will happen on their own, but we kind of also need to pay attention. We need a governance model, slowly but surely. Sometimes it's called an operating model, right? We've got our policies and processes behind it. But almost the most important one, almost here, is who sees what's happening across all the departments? Because we can't be great at governance if everybody's doing everything in little silos. My final suggestions before we open it up to the final discussion and Q&A is figure out who's going to nurture your Power BI community. And they really have to have this as a real thing to do: time, focus, resources, funding, etc. Because it's not going to happen on its own. And just because you stand up, a team site, it's not going to happen on its own for sure. And definitely, you've heard me, hint and say this multiple times. Think about your guidelines that have this balance of control and empowerment. So if we always joke, a DBA's job is to always say no. So if you're an administrator that kind of has that old school mentality, my challenge to you is, from a self-service BI perspective, right? Where can we start evolving? And figure out, when you are building out this community internally, and really governance as a whole, but you need goals and you need to track those goals. So if you need to retain funding or get additional executive support or get something done right, you can prove, here's the progress that we've made, and make sure that you keep getting done what you need to get done. So before I open it up, I'll just point out here at the end, right, we talked about most of these 10, cut a few in the middle short just for time aspects. We talked about how there's, the two paths, right? And that's really important. We can't ask our business users to just hold while we figure out the whole governance framework up front. That's not very practical. Finding, here's where you would find all of the kinds of pieces of content that I produce. So I will leave this up on the screen here in case there's any URLs that you want to jot down here. And at this point, we can kind of just use up the rest of the time for whatever questions there are popping around in everybody's head.
Awesome. Thank you. Fantastic presentation. Very important point mentioned here. Thank you, Melissa. I get lots of positive points. Rossini saying that thank you for helping me approaching the creation of governance while the environment is still almost brand new. People already want to use it in a full view. So a lot of positive feedbacks about that. If anyone has any questions, feel free to write it in the chat window. Now, my question here is that how do you see the process of governance in an organization? You mentioned that this is like an ongoing things, but do you see, for example, companies like those who actually will do it right? Do they have like kind of, let's say, stand-up meetings, weekly meeting, monthly meeting about are they following the rules, definitions, everything that they have in their governance policies, procedures? What is your advice to get it on the right track on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, I think from a day-to-day management standpoint, I think, having the regular check-ins, whether it's daily, weekly, whatever works, right? I think if I take what you just said and put a little twist on it, so we might be tracking issues. So tracking issues and new requests and that kind of stuff, I think will help expose how well are we doing with our processes that we have set up, right? And what needs to change, that kind of thing. And then it's always a good idea to do a retrospective occasionally, maybe quarterly, what's working well, what's not working well, et cetera. That kind of thing. And then there's the auditing side of things. So I have an entire presentation, if you go to my presentations page, where I kind of talk a little bit about getting started with the activity log. But really getting into that activity data and understanding what's happening in Power BI, then we understand how the users are really using the system. And then we can turn around and take action to say, oh, we need to make an improvement here, right? Or we're seeing some unusual or unexpected behavior here. And, and that could be too many exports. That could be way more subscriptions than you expect to see. That could be way more data sets or workspaces or whatever being set up than you expect, right? Whatever it is. So I think it's kind of a combination of managing issues, managing slow continual improvement, watching the auditing side of things, not just for formal auditing, but for how can we help use that to contact people, educate them to turn around and continually get better with their techniques that they're using.
Correct. And I think another thing which is also coming from one of questions, Martin, is that probably we'll need to have some KPIs that actually we check the performance of how this went through, which is, I think, similar to those couples that you mentioned, that all of our certified data sets, for example, have been reviewed twice a year, or things like that, or the audit process and anything like that.
For sure. No, I totally agree. Totally agree. You need some KPIs, and you don't necessarily initially need a lot of them. But yes, that's definitely the best way to go about it.
Fantastic. Thank you. I see we are up at our time and no further questions. Thank you again for your time. Really appreciate anything
Thanks for
else
having me. I always love talking about this stuff.
I encourage everyone to go and check out Melissa's website. There are tons of more information than what she presented here, of course. Feel free to go and there check all the materials over there. If you have any questions later on, feel free to write it in the comments here. I'll somehow pass it to Melissa for getting her feedback on. Thank you. Thanks, Melissa, for your time. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Until next time, stay safe. Bye.
You too. Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Okay, that went